Well, I have personally always thought the Beatitudes were overrated. The Beatitudes are Jesus' introduction to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, and while I found the rest of the sermon to have depth and challenge and forcing me to think, every time I've read the Beatitudes in the past, I've come to the conclusion that they were confusing, vapid, and just a bit shallow. I remember in high school, Reverend Pardon spent the whole summer preaching a series on the Beatitudes, one Sunday after another for the whole summer. And I found the whole thing incredibly boring. But I finally come to the conclusion that I need to take a closer look at the Beatitudes. So this Sunday marks the first in a sermon series on the Beatitudes. Why did Jesus say them? What truth did Jesus want his first listeners to hear? And what possible truth or meaning do they have for us today? And for those who are already bored, I apologize. Now, most of us spend the first 30 years of our lives learning how to be independent. We can't wait for our children to get up and walk. We can't wait for them to learn how to feed themselves or use the bathroom by themselves. We are eager for them to read and do math and then learn to drive so that we can enjoy the freedom and independence that comes with taking the car wherever we want to go. We even go to school to learn how to work and earn a salary so we can finally move out of mom and dad's house. And the better we are at becoming independent, the happier we think we will be. We seek independence with a focus that we don't have for many other things. And we have a fear for losing independence unlike any other fear that we know. Because we believe independence will ultimately make us happy. The problem is Jesus did not agree with this. In fact, Jesus said the way to find real, deep down, soul-filling happiness was by admitting that we were not independent at all. Jesus said we would only be truly satisfied when we could admit that we are fully dependent, fully reliant upon God. And Jesus said the day we admitted our deep need for God, our complete reliance on God for who we are and what we have, would be the day when we would experience the pleasure that comes with the kingdom of heaven. Because that was the day that we would finally be able to take the pressure off ourselves and rest in the presence and the joy of God. So Jesus said we will experience real happiness when we find ourselves poor in spirit. We will be happy when we are completely humble and realize once and for all that God is God and we are not. We want to believe that we're in control of ourselves and others and everything that affects us, but we are not. God is God and we are not. Remember, I was talking to somebody in one of the early congregations that I served and talking about how I'm going to fix this. How's that going to happen? What can I do? And the person looked at me and said, Carly, there is one Savior, and guess what? You're not it. Well, friends, guess what? We're not it. But the idea of being dependent upon anyone or anything flies in the face of almost everything we have learned in life, everything we've tried to achieve, because most of us really kind of like being in charge. We like being in control. And poverty of spirit, admitting that we are completely dependent on God, flies in the face of almost everything we have worked so hard to learn and achieve in our lives. Admitting dependence on anyone, including God, is really hard to do. It's not just hard for us. Dependence flew in the face of almost everything the people listening to Jesus that first day knew and valued. The crowd who was listening to Jesus was gathered near Capernaum, a Roman city on the Sea of Galilee. And those listening were either sharecroppers for Roman landlords or skilled workers working for Roman employers. And the poor in spirit may have been blessed with the kingdom of heaven, but the crowd listening to Jesus that day wanted to be rich in everything that would get them freedom from Rome. everything that would give them freedom from Roman landlords, everything that would get them freedom from Roman employers, everything that would set them free from Roman military. In fact, the only thing the crowd believed they needed to be happy that day was freedom from Rome. Because with freedom from Rome, they would finally be independent. Excuse me. So the crowd sought freedom in ways that did not include poverty of spirit. Didn't include poverty at all. Because most of them wanted the ability to make enough money to buy themselves out of their crop sharing from Roman landlords. Most of them believed that they didn't really need God to set them free, but they needed to be able to follow the rules of the law well enough that God would finally send the Messiah to set them free. Most of them, a lot of them, did not believe in this poverty of spirit stuff. They believed in a huge stash of weapons so that they could raise an army to defeat the Roman Empire and thus earn independence from Rome for themselves, for their nation, for their children, grandchildren, and so on. Excuse me. So they were looking to be independent. And they didn't rely on God for this soul deep happiness. They wanted to rely on their own actions, their own power, their own selves. So the crowd was not ready to admit that God was God and they were not, because they wouldn't want to let themselves be humble enough to trust God to care for them. God hadn't taken care of them so far. Rome was still there, so they better pick up their whatever and do it themselves. The problem is, the more the crowd depended on themselves, the more problems they made for themselves and for those around them. In fact, their desire for independence eventually ended 3 decades later with the destruction of the nation of Israel by the Roman legion for the next 2,000 years. So Jesus said those who were poor in spirit would would experience the kingdom of heaven. So humility rather than wars, rituals, and wealth would set them free to be satisfied with life. And rather than trying to do it themselves, Jesus said they would be happiest when they admitted just how much they needed God, how completely reliant they were on God. One of the things Jesus talked a lot about in his ministry was happiness, how to be happy. And if we're looking to power, privilege, wealth, stuff, and position to make us happy, we're looking to things that are temporary at best. Things that are easily taken away. However, if we're looking to experience the kingdom of heaven, well, that's a kind of happiness that nothing can be taken away from us except our own attitudes. Most of us believe our ability to do things for ourselves is the key to happiness. The problem is everything we do to be independent is so easily lost. Money? Temporary. Physical abilities? Temporary. Stuff breaks, gets lost, or grows too old or broken to be useful. Privilege depends on who has power at the moment. That's always changing. Even driving, the thing most of us love the most and will hang on to the hardest, it's temporary. All the things we have worked so hard to achieve that make us independent are things we can lose in the blink of an eye. And the day we finally admit we are totally, completely dependent on the kingdom of God for who we are and what we have, is the day we'll finally experience the kingdom of heaven. God and God's presence are the only things that we cannot and will not ever lose. So my mom was living in assisted living when she fell and broke her shoulder. And when I visited immediately after, I learned that the doctor had suggested she get a 4-footed cane for getting around. It would be something that would help her be secure and not tumble over again. Balance was not her best subject. So I went out while I was doing other errands, went to the pharmacy and bought that 4-footed cane for Mom. And I brought it in while she was having lunch with the other people in the assisted living thing and gave it to her. And without looking at me, Mother said in a very soft and very angry voice, "Get that thing out of here." Which I said, "Mom, it's just a cane." I've used walkers and canes when I had my bad hips and when I had my bad knee. They're really helpful. At which point she looked at me and said, well, then you have absolutely no pride. If only she was right. I have way too much pride for my own good. And there are a lot of days when depending on myself seems easier than depending on God or anybody else. I have enough pride to make myself and those around me miserable, right?
I don't believe that. Not going there.
The way I wisely chose to not make a comment. But then, I suspect I'm not alone. I suspect I'm not the only one who has enough pride to make themselves and everyone around them miserable. I suspect when we are determined that things are going to turn out the way we want them to, we all forget that God is God, and we are not. When we believe it is up to us to keep the children and the grandchildren in our care safe, well-educated, and successful, we may have trouble admitting that their safety is not up to us. That accidents will happen. Illness will happen. Inability to excel in the subjects we really wish they would excel in may not happen. Admitting that we depend on God and God alone for the success and the safety and the abilities of our children and our grandchildren, most of us can't admit that. When we believe that it's up to us to save every penny that crosses our hands so we can guarantee our financial security in the future, well, we don't like to admit just how fragile those nest eggs can be. Just think 2008. Most of us have more than enough pride to believe on occasion that we really are in charge. That we are completely independent, that we have the power, the ability, and the intellect not just to control our lives, but those around us, if they were just smart enough to listen. However, we eventually discover that the longer we hold on to that notion that we can be in charge, that we can be independent, that we can decide for ourselves and everybody else what ought to take place, well, the more miserable we will become, and the more miserable everybody around us will become. Friends, we are completely reliant upon God for who we are and for what we have. And when we can finally admit that to ourselves, and more importantly, confess it to God, that's the day we'll discover we know how to be poor in spirit. And that's the day when we will experience the kingdom of heaven. The joy, the relief, the satisfaction from knowing that God is God, and we are not. Amen.